Hi everyone. I hope you guys can see me correctly. Let's give it 1 second. Are we alive? Hi everyone and welcome to the launch of State of Hate 2021, which is our annual report. Unfortunately, obviously we can't do this offline as we always do, but we're glad to have so many people joining us today here at YouTube live. Before we get started, I just wanted to say a couple of words about what's going to happen this hour and a half. So I'm Afrida Chowdhury. I am the Operations and Activism Officer. We're soon going to be joined by the CEO of Hope Not Hate, Nick Lowles. But before that, I just wanted to say we're going to talk for about, let's say 45 minutes or so. And then we're going to be able to you're going to be able to ask questions. So there's a chat box somewhere here on YouTube that you can use, and you can start asking questions already now. So please feel free to start asking questions already. And I'm just going to get started. I know we're a couple of minutes late. So with further ado, I'm going to introduce Nick Lowles, who want to say a couple of words. Thank you.
Thanks, Frida, and thanks everyone for joining us this morning. Before I introduce David Lammy, our guest speaker, I just want to say a big thank you to the Hope Not Hate team. The amount of work that went into the State of Hate report has been phenomenal. It's bigger and I think better than anything that we have done before. Not only for the people who wrote for it, but also for the people who helped put this together and people who've done the media and the associated kind of work on the website. So it's a really great team effort, and I think reflective of the work that we do. I also want to say a thank you to the Hope Not Hate supporters and members. We have over 3,000 people who give to us every month. Without your support, we wouldn't have been able to do this report, and we wouldn't be able to do much of the work that we do. So a massive thank you to you. And if you're not a member but would like to become a member, please go to our website and click on the big red box in the right-hand corner. So I just want to say a few things about the State of Hate report. For those who are getting a physical copy, it's 144 pages. It is, I think, it is the most comprehensive analysis and survey of the far right in the UK. I think we're now in our 7th or 8th year of doing it, and it is bigger and better, and it's also broader than anything that we've done before. So one of the things about this report is that we obviously look at the far right, we look at the different elements, the organisations, the individuals, the trends, but we also try to put it into a wider perspective. And clearly 2020 was dominated by the COVID pandemic, and that obviously had a huge impact on the far right. It quickened up the kind of demise of the traditional far right and the old kind of far right political parties. But also what we saw was a kind of younger, more nimble generation of tech-savvy activists become more prominent and more active. We saw the move away from organisations to what we call the post-organisational world, and the kind of rise of citizen journalists and the kind of individuals using tech and social media to propagate their views. Obviously, with the coronavirus pandemic, we saw the massive rise of conspiracy theories. Many of these conspiracies were kind of, I say, fairly harmless in of themselves, but obviously conspiracies are a gateway, and once you start questioning everything, once you start questioning kind of authority and science and fact, you very easily go down the rabbit hole and start believing other forms of conspiracy. And while over the last 6 months we've seen the quite significant drop in support for QAnon in the UK, and our Hope Not Hate report goes into that. It's still worrying that as many as 22% of Britons still believe some of the key kind of tenets of QAnon and some of the key conspiracy theories. We look into terrorism, the continued rise of far-right terrorism, 12 people convicted in 2020, 6 of whom were teenagers, and obviously this is deeply kind of concerning to us. And finally, we've seen quite a lot of action in 2020 from social media platforms, from internet companies to deplatform, to take away hate. And while we applaud that, there's still a lot more to do. But also, obviously, that has shifted hate onto unmoderated platforms, and so they pose a different danger, albeit to a smaller audience. So I'd just like to introduce David Lammy, who's going to be our guest speaker. I'm sure everyone knows David, but he is the Shadow Secretary of State for Justice and the Shadow Lord Chancellor. More importantly, though, David is a tireless campaigner for social and racial justice, and a really thoughtful and intelligent man. And I'm really honoured and really thankful to him for taking the time out of a busy schedule to come and speak to us this morning. So, David, over to you.
Well, look, thank you, Nick, so much. And thank you to Hope Not Hate, all your members and supporters, for everybody who is out there, who is feeling intimidated, frightened, scared, cowed by extremism in our country and by the hate that it spews. I really, really want to thank you for inviting me to speak in the wake of what is a very, very worrying report. Now, I found that making speeches over Zoom is not ideal, certainly not the way I like to make speeches. So what I want to do is offer some broad reflections, really, on some of the things that struck me whilst reading the report. The first is to say, or to recognise that in this last year, we also saw, of course, the death of George Floyd and his murder at the hands of police officers. And at that moment, the world, the global community paused, perhaps because it was a pandemic and people were at home, glued to the news. They focused in for the first time, particularly on race and racism. I received calls from so many organizations. I seem to be one of the first ports of call in this country on issues of race and diversity, from long lost friends, from not-for-profits, from FTSE 100 companies asking how they could improve racial diversity in their boardrooms. On the one hand, I'm incredibly grateful to be given the platform to speak about Black people and broadly to lead parts of the conversation. On the other hand, I can't help but think, why aren't you asking those in power? And it's important to say that 97% of Britain's elite is controlled by white people. Just 36 of 1,000 of the UK's top political, judicial, financial, cultural, and security roles are held by ethnic minorities. Black unemployment is now running at 9% compared to an average of 4%. And there's a 13% attainment gap between Black and white students at university. The very idea of the social contract is supposed to bind us together for the benefit and peace of all. But when rights and resources are allocated along racial lines, communities of colour and of difference rightly question why this social contract was designed in the first place. The social contract that binds all of us to the law in this country dates back to the Magna Carta, which states no one will we deny or delay right or justice. Yet 800 years later, the disproportionality that people of colour face in this country is flying in the face of the very legislation which underpins the foundation of our society. Black people are 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched. Black, Asian and minority ethnic people make up 51% of the youth justice system, whilst representing 14% of the general population. And the challenge of hate in Britain today is that it exists from top to bottom. And this report shows not only how widespread hate is, but very, very sadly and worryingly, how entrenched it is. To some extent, I'm a bit of a Twitter addict. I'd say that I usually tweet around 10 times a day on a quiet day, usually a mixture of pointing out prime ministerial cock-ups to pictures of my dog or cakes that my wife and I have baked on our children's birthday. The comments on my tweets range from messages of support to pointing out how atrociously Spurs are performing in the Premier League. However, in August last year, one Twitter user said that I should hang from a lamppost. It took days before this user's account was suspended, only after myself and members of the government called out this abuse. Social media platforms aren't just a place for people to freely spout racial abuse. They're also a means of organisation for groups where hate is at the core of their ideology, as this report shows. The far-right scene has flourished online, with social media companies being far too slow to ban these groups. One study shows that far-right attacks have increased by a staggering 250% globally since 2014, to a level not seen in the last 50 years. Brenton Tarrant, who murdered 51 people outside mosques in New Zealand, frequented right-wing discussion boards on 4chan and 8chan, and said that he found YouTube to be a significant source of information and inspiration. He then was able to live stream his brutal murders on Facebook and had published his white supremacist manifesto online. Robert Bowers, who attacked the Jewish community in Pittsburgh in 2018 and murdered 11, was a follower of online provocateurs on the fringes of the far right. He promoted anti-Semitic conspiracy theories online and posted photos of the weapons that he would use in his attack. The fallout of the pandemic and the impending recession will provide fertile ground for terrorist groups wanting to recruit those who are disillusioned with social reality. Social media platforms need to ensure that they are prepared for this eventuality and can break their media coverage and online social networks. Government and security services need to get to grips with the less well-known sites such as Gab, Parler and BitChute to prevent the indoctrination of people who feel adrift of society. As this report points out, far-right individuals and organisations are dynamic in their use of different platforms for different purposes. Social media platforms need to be just as dynamic in shutting them down. Facebook, Instagram, Twitter and many others were created out of democracies and aim to give a voice to anyone, anywhere. These platforms must be equally wary of those who seek to undermine such freedoms. The relationship between disinformation and extremism is a symbiotic one. Both feed off one another and, if left alone, can spiral out of control. The users of social media are not the only ones to blame for the spread of fake news. The responsibility lies with those who have a voice, including, of course, mainstream politicians. Only a few months ago, we witnessed the deaths of 5 individuals after a group of far-right extremists marched on the Capitol building in Washington. Many were inspired both by President Trump's false allegations of voter fraud, but were also adherents to QAnon as a cult. Just a few months earlier, Donald Trump warned Black Lives protesters that when the looting starts, the shooting starts. Often, conspiracy theorists and their adherents are thought of as simply existing in the fringes of society, yet they are far more entrenched than people might think. One recent poll taken shortly after the attack on the Capitol found that 29% of Republican adults subscribed to the theories that were being espoused by QAnon. During the pandemic, conspiracy theories flourished in an environment where all of us relied on news from inside our homes. Since the rollout of the vaccine, all efforts have been focused on making and distributing the vaccine. No one ever asked what happens when people do not want it. Although some believe that COVID-19 is a deep state conspiracy, there are far more who are simply hesitant. In a time when members of our government tell us that Britain has had enough of experts, it comes as no surprise that there are many who have a lack of trust in the guidance that they are giving. Social media has become a breeding ground for conspiracy theorists over the past year. Anti-vaxxer groups have capitalized on some of the most common concerns to spread disinformation while sowing fear and distrust amongst vulnerable groups. And those in positions of authority need to understand how fragile the public's trust is in our institutions and how limited, if you like, that trust has become. It's up to them, myself included, to show the public why they should put their trust in them. Whether it's anti-Black racism, online hate, or conspiracies, we need to ask ourselves, why is it that the majority of these people are men? Most distressingly, we need to ask ourselves why it took the murder of Sarah Everard in our country for us to ask this question. Of all of the problems that have been exacerbated by the pandemic, violence toward women has not received the attention it needs. It was only a year ago, the height of the pandemic, that my wife and I heard the news that our friend's two daughters, Nicole Smallman and Bieber Henry, were murdered in Wembley. They were meeting friends in a park to celebrate Bieber's birthday and were found stabbed to death the following day. Their mother then learnt those police officers had taken selfies with her daughter's dead bodies. Unfortunately, the story of violence and abuse against women is an all too common occurrence. A woman is murdered by a man in this country every 3 days. 97% of women aged 18 to 24 have been sexually harassed, with a further 19% not reporting those situations because of their belief that it would not change a thing. The situation has become so critical in the UK throughout the pandemic that women's refuges have had to turn women away due to the increase in demand. A decade of government cuts to women's organisations have left these organisations unprepared to deal with the scale of the issue. Solace Women's Aid, which runs 22 refugees in London, said that they were unable to take 700 calls in September last year due to a lack of resources. Our culture, entrenched by a patriarchal society, fuels this hate. It is acceptable to intimidate women on the street, to comment on their body, and give women a fear of assault. This is made acceptable because men get away with it. Only 1.4% of reported rapes resulted in a suspect being charged. Once again, our social contract is not doing what it was set up to do. After reading the report on the state of hate, as well as listening to what I have said so far, it is understandable that some of you might feel hopeless. Yet what this past year has given us is a renewed sense of responsibility, both for ourselves and others around us. After the murder of George Floyd, people around the world came together to show their opposition to injustices. Governments and intergovernmental organisations are getting together on social media companies to do more to tackle online hate and discrimination. The tireless work of women's groups and politicians has led the police now identifying and recording misogynistic hate crimes. From Black Lives Matter's protests to the criminalisation of misogyny, these movements reflect a broader ambition. And it is an ambition for building institutions that work for everyone. It is about rethinking a social contract that does not just believe in equality, but also in equity. After having been in some form of lockdown for almost a year, people in this country have been sitting at home and have had a chance to reflect on some of the events that have shocked all of us. The death of George Floyd, the storming of the Capitol, the murder of Sarah Everhard. They have forced everyone to take note and call for those in power to make changes. Hate thrives in an environment of complacency. Hope, not hate, does vital work to ensure that everyone has to be aware of the scale of the problem. We must do everything we can to protect the substantive power of the movement. Keep fighting for genuine transformative change. We cannot allow these issues to be pulled into a culture war in which governments pit us against one another. Those who are most fearful of change push these issues into a toxic trench so that they can gain the upper ground. We must keep focused on the goal, eradicating structural racism and discrimination from all areas of society: employment, housing, education, health, the criminal justice system. We cannot look back in 5 years and remember the events of last year as just another item in the news cycle. We have to transform our righteous anger into meaningful reform. The fundamental truth is that change does not come about by letting other people do the work for you. Change comes about when every one of us fights injustice, when we see it. And this report shows the scale of the challenge we are facing. It's up to us to bend the arc of justice in the right direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David, for that very, very comprehensive speech. And before we move on to the panel, I just want to see if everyone can see the panel. Yes, there we have the panel. Before we move on to these lovely people, we're going to show a little clip from our colleague in Bradford, who's worked with resilience in their community, and he's going to explain, our colleague Paul is going to explain how they've kind of fought those narratives in their society. So please cue video.
So we're in Ravenscliffe, Eccleshill Ward in Bradford. We first came here in about 2000. The first time we ever tried to leaflet here against the BNP. There were a gang of about 30 men zeegiling at us. That's when we really knew that we had to do more than just leaflets. We did a big event at a rugby club up the road, a family fun day, the first time we'd done one like that. And Nick Lowles did us a brand new leaflet, a better leaflet that we'd ever had before. But all we ever were able to do was firefight. It's a very deprived area. It's in the top 10% for every kind of deprivation. And it's one of the places that Open at 8 Bradford does a lot of work. Behind us we've got the Gateway Centre. So we're working with Gateway at the moment to produce a quarterly newsletter. Obviously we'll have our messages of Open at 8 on that newsletter, but also we want to talk about signposting. If you live here, you're going to die 15 or 20 years earlier than if you live 10 miles away up road. That's a fact of life. There's a lot of signposting, a lot of work we can do with the community to make life better. Because what we can't do is just turn up every time there's an election with a leaflet. That kind of firefighting doesn't work. If we're going to talk to residents about the issues that affect them on a daily level, whether it's about food poverty at the minute, or whether it's about health outcomes, or whether it's about education, or all the underlying problems that people have got. We've got to be far better embedded in communities, and that's what Open Not Hate in Bradford are trying to do. We're trying to become part of these communities and part of the solutions that they need. So we've gone from a place where we were Z-guiled at. We don't get chased round here now. We've got something to say and something to offer now, and that's work we've got to build on.
In Bradford, filmed a couple of months ago, that shows the work that we've been doing. But before that, we are going to go to the panel now, and I just want to introduce the panel now. So we are joined by, as you see, Nick, as I've already introduced, and David. And additionally, we have Joe Mulhall and Roxana Khan Williams, who's joined us from Hope Not Hate. So I'm going to start digging in straight into the questions. So we got in a couple of questions, and just feel free, anyone, to pitch in. If you have any comments, just go ahead and speak about it. So the first question that we've gotten in is, how has COVID changed things for the far right? Has it made it harder for them to organize or given them new ways to recruit online? And I would also love to hear a little bit more, like an overview about the report that we've written, which is, I know, more than 100 pages. But let's try to compromise that into this hour and a half that we have. Thanks.
Shall I jump in there? Yeah, I can touch on how COVID affect things. We talk about that at real length in the report. Essentially, the pandemic has provided opportunities for the far right, but also real challenges. For some of the far right, they've been locked indoors like everyone else, and it's meant that their ability to mobilize and organize has been seriously curtailed. And what I think we've actually seen during the pandemic is, like in lots of other areas of society, existing trends have been exacerbated by the pandemic. So those bits of the far right which were outdated, that were very traditional in the way they organized, it was about leafleting, it was about street protests, it was kind of street politics. Those sorts of groups, like the British National Party and the National Front, that had been in decline for many years, went into further and steeper and faster decline. But in their place, the opportunities were that you had this mass of people sat online, looking for content, new corridors into the far right through the conspiracy scene and the like. And so those elements of the far right that were more agile, that were more modern, that were tech savvy, that were happy to engage in different forms of political activism than the traditional sense. That could be videos, that could be book clubs, that could be baking clubs, that could be homeschooling even. Those groups did better. And so some of the older groups like the BNP and National Front went into further decline, but things like Patriotic Alternative did better. They started to kind of hoover up those elements of the far right that still wanted to be active. And then I think I'd also say is that we've been talking about this for a number of years at Hope Not Hate, what we call the post-organizational far right. And by that we mean thousands of individuals engaging in far right activism outside of the confines of traditional far right organizations, outside of things like leadership structures, membership cards, engaging often online in what we call micro donations of time, effort, sometimes donations, sometimes, just social media activity. And these people act almost like a school of fish, thousands of people moving towards specific issues at specific times collectively, but without like formal leadership. And what you have is kind of leadership figures, and people like Tommy Robinson might be one nowadays, but these are often people with large social media followings. And that has increased. Again, these sorts of ability to organize in new ways, in online ways, increased during the pandemic. And I think the State of Hate report really reflects that this year, in that there is more individuals profiled than ever before. Yes, we continue to profile all of the traditional far-right groups, but we also profile lots and lots of individuals. These kind of what we call far-right or fascist social media influencers are profiled in kind of much more detail. And then just briefly, I don't want to go on for too long, but two of the big trends we talk about in this State of Hate in terms of what the far-right were talking about last year. Well, so firstly, it's worth remembering that Brexit kind of came to an end as the real mobilizing force at the beginning of last year for the far right, and they were hunting around for alternative things to mobilize around. And they did two things. One, of course, was a real backlash to the Black Lives Matter moment. We saw this kind of huge societal discussion about race, racism, colonial legacy, systemic racism, and the far right really reacted against this. Understandably, not surprisingly, did they kind of backlash against this discussion about racial justice. But it did in two ways. One is the really explicitly, overtly anti-Black racist groups like Patriotic Alternative and the more extreme elements of the far right tried to capitalize on it with discussions about white lives matter and the like. That's not a surprise. What was interesting, though, was those elements of the far right that have been for 10 years telling us they don't care about race. They only care about identity, culture. People like Tommy Robinson, Stephen Yaxley-Lennon, people that were saying that they talked in terms of culture, not race. The masks slipped last year, and we started to see them talk in much more overtly racial terms, much more overtly talking about whiteness, race, anti-Black racism. So that happened. And then the second thing that happened was, in some ways, almost a return to things you might have seen 15 years ago when the far right was obsessed with immigration and migration. We saw the cross-channel migration really shoot up the agenda for the British far right last year. And when I talk about these kind of post-organizational people, we're talking about, in many cases now, they identify themselves as citizen journalists. And we saw really importantly last year a small group of so-called citizen journalists making a huge amount of fuss about cross-channel migration in Dover, and this really lit a fire under the British far right. We saw them creating a huge amount of content on a daily basis about migration, about hotels being used, about barracks being used, and then this kind of set the agenda for the British far right, really. And then what we saw is more traditional groups like Britain First and For Britain taking up the issue of cross-channel migration. Nigel Farage piled in, and of course we then saw Priti Patel echoing some of the rhetoric in a really dangerous way. And so by the end of the year, we really had a far right that was campaigning around anti-Black racism and anti-immigration, anti-migration. This is a far right that in many ways looks much more like the far right of some decades ago than it did, say, a few years ago when it was much more about supposedly about culture and that sort of stuff. So this mixture of anti-Black Lives Matter, pro-statues, that sort of kind of rhetoric, and anti-migrant and anti-asylum seeker politics was really where the far right started 2021. And I think if we're looking forward this year, I think we're going to continue to see this kind of post-organizational far right causing problems. We're going to continue to see lots of huge amount of content being created online. But as things reopen, we will, of course, see a return to the streets. We will see people standing in elections. We've, of course, got big elections coming up in the next few months, and we're expecting to see a number of far right people standing in those. But really, I think as we start to see boats return to the shores, as the weather gets better, I think we're going to see another narrative, and that's going to be the use of COVID, right? We're going to start to see people in the far right already talking about COVID being a problem in the continent being brought over by migrants. So I think we can expect to see this kind of talk of invasion and then bringing disease is going to be a real worrying one to watch from the far right this year.
Can I just jump in with a couple of things just to add to what Joe said? I mean, I think that, when we look back at 2020, I think the other thing that was happening was obviously because people spent a lot more time on the internet and because obviously the big expansion of conspiracy theories, it brought a whole new kind of layer of people into both conspiracies, but it introduced them to some far right ideas as well. And I think that, and new kind of audiences. And I think that this is really kind of concerning, and we're not sure where it's going to go. But 10, 15 years ago, for anyone to kind of obtain, let's say, Holocaust denial material, you really had to go to a site of a kind of the extreme far right or something like that. Whereas these days, some of these ideas, some of these conspiracies are kind of mingled in much broader, much wider kind of platform. So I think that we haven't really seen the consequence of the conspiracy theories and the rise of literally hundreds of thousands of people who've been drawn into these ideas. And of course, once you start believing in one conspiracy theory, you're much more likely to believe in others. The kind of second point I'll make is that part of the State of Hope report is obviously a snapshot of looking back at 2020, but it also looks forward as well, both in terms of the dangers coming down the road and also where we as Hope Not Hate, but also the kind of wider progressive movement needs to place themselves to kind of meet these challenges. And I think just as 2020 was dominated by COVID and then the kind of backlash to Black Lives Matters in terms of the far right, I think looking forward, we have this toxic mix of, the economic impact on COVID, and we all know that that will probably mean greater austerity, and we all know that there's certain communities that are struggling already that are going to get most affected by that, and we know that when people lose hope and are more pessimistic, they're more likely to go towards fear and hate. We have the consequences of Brexit as well. Now, Brexit might have politically been kind of finished with the UK coming out of the EU, but the economic consequences of it haven't really been fully felt yet. And I think some of these have been disguised because of the COVID pandemic. We're already seeing some of the issues in Northern Ireland, supply chains, the massive drop in export. That's going to have an economic impact as well. And I think thirdly, and again, this is not necessarily a specific Hope Not Hate issue, but the consequences of it are, we are looking at a potential constitutional crisis, whether it's about Scotland and independence, whether it's about the Brexit trade deal and Northern Ireland and the border in the Irish Sea. This is all going to play out on the ground. So I think these three factors together, combined with what Joe was saying about the kind of, the kind of return of kind of overt racism of the far right, I think we're going to be in deeply kind of turbulent times for the next few years as well.
Thank you. So on the topic of conspiracy theories, I know you touched upon this a little bit, but there's a question about how QAnon supporters have reacted to Trump's defeat. So last year we warned about that there was going to be a lot of QAnon supporters. What's the status of them now? Have they survived? Are they growing? Are they declining? So what's going on with them?
Yeah, I can jump in again. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, obviously, we've been monitoring QAnon. I mean, in some ways, the rise of QAnon last year was pretty meteoric, right? I mean, we talked in the last, if you think about the beginning of 2020, at Hope Not Hate, we monitored a tiny handful of European QAnon accounts and people. By the summer and autumn of last year, we were looking at groups with hundreds of thousands of people. Now, of course, one of the core elements of QAnon was, Trump as this savior figure, and there's been obviously a huge amount of disappointment in the British far right. In the QAnon scene around the world about what's happened with his loss. But what I think is really worth pointing out is that in the report that my colleagues Gregory and David wrote last year about QAnon, they split QAnon into two forms, right? And they split it into one set which was very traditional American QAnon. It was all about Trump. It was hyper-partisan. It was about Republican politics. But they also identified this much broader form of QAnon, which still believes there is a secret cabal of pedophiles running the world, but it was much less attached to that kind of Republican and American politics. And that, of course, is much less affected by the loss of Trump. This will continue. And so there's that element to it. I think QAnon will rumble on in different forms. We're already seeing it mutate into different things. But broadly speaking, the actual danger here is this much broader conspiracy scene that Nick was mentioning. And one of the things we're really worrying, and we highlight in this report, is how that's becoming a gateway to anti-Semitism. Right? So it's not just, QAnon is part of a broad conspiracy movement we've seen emerge in the UK in the last year, and we've seen huge numbers engaging with conspiracy content online. And if you have this kind of grand conspiracy, whether or not it's about 5G, whether or not it's about secret paedophile cabals running the world, whether or not it's about COVID-19 being a hoax, you name it. If you start to have a grand conspiracy, you need a conspirator. And of course, when you have a conspirator, invariably for these people, it ends up being the Jewish community and secret power run by Jews. And so that's something really to watch out, seeing that route towards anti-Semitism through the conspiracy scene rather than through the far right. And that kind of new radicalization pathway is one to really, really watch out for. And that won't be changed by the loss of Donald Trump in North America.
Thanks, Joe. We have gotten a question from Debbie Abrahams MP, and she would like to ask David and Nick. First of all, she says, great video of local approaches in Bradford, but how can we develop or spread these local approaches and networks, and what amendments are needed in the online harms bill?
Do you want to go first, Nick?
Well, I'll kind of talk about the community element, because I think, Hope Not Hate tries to do two things. Obviously, we spend a lot of time focusing on hate, but you know, as is obvious by our name, you need to replace hate with something. And I think, you know, one of the things that we've learned a long time ago is that people have real or perceived grievances, and you can't go into communities, you know, that might voted for the BNP in the past or whatever and just kind of condemn people. You have to look at why they're doing it. You have to address some of the issues, and sometimes it means debunking some of the kind of racialization of social and economic problems which the far right try to push. But I think really, you know, the example given in Bradford is on one hand quite unique, but it's the type of work that we do need to do everywhere, and it is that long-term, low-level work. And I think it's primarily coming from the position is of how we get people, how can we think people can trust us when we need them to vote in a particular way or vote against a particular party if we've not tried to help them as well. And part of that is by doing the long work, hard work in communities, supporting people. And it's not about us going into communities and trying to kind of show them what to do or whatever. It really is about supporting people already in the communities and showing that we are on their side. We're trying to be helpful. We're trying to give them tools that they can, you know, fight for better rights for themselves or better facilities or etc. I mean, I think that certainly for us, one of our priorities over the next year or two, particularly, as I say, against the background of kind of growing economic hardship and Brexit hardship, is that we need to get back into these communities, because I think you know, part of the wider political dissatisfaction is that some people feel that politicians don't speak for them, or the political elite or progressive organisations don't speak for them, and you know, we can't just expect people to follow us and expect people to think in a particular way. We have to work with people side. Certainly one of our key kind of priorities over the next 2 years is to do more of this type of work, you know, either by doing work on the ground or at least sharing these examples and plenty of other examples, both what we do and other people do. You know, we have a project underway at the moment called Hopeful Towns, and that really is trying to both on the kind of policy level address, identify, highlight and address some of these economic issues, but at the same time it's about sharing good practice so people can kind of upskill and be in a better position to push back against hate in their local community.
I think what I'd like to say is that if we went back 30 years or so, despite the fact that there was growing evidence about how harmful and toxic tobacco was for people's health and their lungs, governments were timid, nervous, cowed by big tobacco. And it just took decades for governments to step up and make the right choices on behalf of their populations. And I'm afraid we're seeing with online platforms, with internet service providers, a similar kind of timidity, really, in the wake of some serious problems. The fines have got to be substantially bigger. The challenge has got to be substantially bigger. And you cannot just leave it for these platforms and service providers, it seems to me, to police themselves. There is a powerful role for the state to intervene on behalf of communities and populations. And I have to say, I personally have also got some problems with some of the anonymity that these platforms allow. I think the other thing I would say at this time, and it goes back to the previous question, is this is a period in which mental health and well-being has been predominant in the debate, because clearly a lot of people have been hugely affected by isolation, by lack of purpose in relation to work, and by spending so much time online. And sadly, that will have consequences in relation to those that will then be seduced by extremism because of their mental health status. I think the other problem is that very, very sadly, We know that there are young people whose education has been hugely harmed over this period. And so we have to keep in our mind's eye that young white working class boy who has fallen backwards, he's age 15 or 16 in his education, and may not catch up. In fact, may not now take school nearly as seriously as it was taken before, may never get back into proper full-time education, and now can be seduced by some of the extremism around him. We've got to keep in mind the young black boy in a similar situation in a constituency like mine that might now fall into the hands of groomers and pimps to run county lines. And we've got to keep in mind the young Muslim boy that can be seduced by a different kind of extremism. I'm afraid poverty, mental health, education, all of them can combine to create the situations that are very fertile for these groups and hate. And we have to be very vigilant over this next period in communities, because very, very sadly, the pandemic will have created a cauldron into which the far right particularly, and extremism, can find a home.
Can I just jump back in there? I mean, David, I think you're absolutely right. The other thing I think is important to say, we clearly need to toughen up the rules, and we need to make social media companies, which make a huge amount of money, morally and legally responsible for the contents that put on their site. But at the same time, I think that we've also got to recognise that we can't just legislate against hate. We need to win hearts and minds, and we need to win the political argument. And I worry that we are drifting into the answer to online hate is just about laws, toughening up, bigger fines, and obviously that's one element. But I mean, I've been hearing, and I don't know where this is going, but I've been hearing in the Home Office that there is now a consideration to drop counter-extremism in favour of focusing almost exclusively or much larger part on kind of hate crime and online hate, and that would be a massive mistake. Yes, we need to do more about online hate, but we've also got to work in the communities that are in a way feeding this as well. And I think sometimes that's the harder work, that's certainly the more expensive work. But if you look at the places, the Barking and Dagenhams, the Lutons, the Bradfords, the Oldhams, I mean, Debbie asked the question, we need to do work in these communities, both to tackle extremism, find ways to bring communities together, but also to address the issues that give rise to it in the first place. You can't have one or the other. You've got to have a combination of the two.
Thanks, Nick and David. And before we move on, if you have any questions, please feel free to kind of put them in the chat box as we go. I'm going to take the questions as we go as well. But since we're on the topic of hate crime, I wanted to jump in and talk a little bit general about a part of our State of Hate report where we speak about hate crime. And in general, it's quite hard to quantify it. It's underreported, it's inaccessible, and it's inconsistent. And we kind of need a better training on how to identify hate crime. And since July 2020, or since last year, we've seen a clear spike of hate crimes along racial lines. For those who remember, last week in Atlanta, we saw 8 people brutally murdered, Asian people brutally murdered along the lines of racial hate. And anti-Asian hate crime, or in other words, xenophobia, is not just exclusively exclusive to US. In the UK, in June 2020 last year, we saw 457 race-related anti-Asian crimes reported, which is 3 times higher than previous 2 years. It's 300% more as well since last year. So this also goes into question other types of hate crimes that are very underreported. So there's a question also about that we need to kind of think about hate crimes along the lines that's not just far right related. And another question that came up was also that hate does not just come from the far right. We've seen Islamophobia time and time again inside the Conservative Party, but also in general as a hate crime. So, Roxana, I wanted to ask you, how have anti-Muslim hatred as well been visualized in the wake of pandemic? Isn't that something that should be highlighted too? I highlighted the anti-Asian hate crimes, but what about Islamophobia?
Sure. So I think for many of us, when lockdown started, we easily thought that perhaps lockdown would give some breathing room for against Muslims and other targeted minorities. I think with the power of sight, we can see the opposite has been true. So in a report I co-authored with Professor Imran Awan, looking at coronavirus and the relationship and Islamophobia, we analysed across Facebook, Twitter, Telegram, and WhatsApp groups, and we found a significant number of us sharing content portraying as super spreaders, as anti-British, and in some cases even using COVID as a form of corona jihad. So one video shared on Telegram by Stephen Yaxley Lennon, aka Robinson, alleges to show a group of Muslim men leaving a secret mosque in Birmingham to pray during lockdown. This video had been shared 10,000 times on the platform. It was revealed that the original footage had actually been taken weeks before lockdown was announced. But by this point, it didn't matter, because video, along with other content, had helped to push this narrative that Muslims flouting social distancing rules and were exceptional for doing so. I'm not trying to posit that Muslims didn't down rules in some circumstances, but was that community particular in doing so? No, I don't think so. And I think this framing of this and the sexualization of Muslims made the community or communities very vulnerable to hate online. I think what's slightly more worrying about this is that this rhetoric has been confided to kind of internet forums or even on social media. Instead, narrative penetrated the mainstream, and we have freed politicians, for instance, as other. And there have been numerous examples where conservative politicians or councillors have regurgitated far-right, pinpointing Muslims as responsible for spreading COVID-19, and often with no recourse to action. But perhaps that shouldn't be that surprising, because anti-Muslim sentiment is rife within our political institutions, and it emboldens the far right, and it's created this kind of vicious cycle of legitimization and hatred. So, for example, against Muslim women went up 375% when Boris Johnson described Muslim women in niqabs as bank robbers and letterboxes. And the constant securitization of Muslims in the media has contributed to 37% of people thinking that Islam poses a threat to the British way of life. 32% believe that there are no-go areas in Britain where Sharia law dominates and non-Muslims cannot enter. And 7% of people not willing to accept them as a member of their family. And, this kind of state of hate towards Muslims doesn't just affect Muslims, but the whole social fabric of society. And I therefore think it's of paramount importance that we continue to call this out, raise awareness of it as well, both within kind of our communities, but also kind of going up to churches as well.
Thanks, Roxy. I'm going to move on to some more questions. I know we have half an hour and there's plenty of questions coming in. And if you are unable to ask questions, do refresh the page. I'm going to give you like 15 seconds to do that so we don't move on. I think the chat box was a bit offline, but if you try to refresh your YouTube page, it should be working for you now. All right. So I'm going to move on to the next question. And it's about, so obviously the report mainly focuses on the far right. which is it has originally done, but isn't it rhetorics from people like Priti Patel to blame too? I know we touched upon it, but if someone could elaborate a little bit, that would be great.
Well, look, can I just say very squarely, can I just say politically, I think it's incredibly worrying the way that what was perceived to be on the fringe has come into the mainstream. When we talk about populism, we are effectively talking much more about mainstream politicians deliberately stealing the clothes from the extreme and bringing it to the centre. And there's a lot of it going on. And let's be clear, last week in Parliament, we had a bill that was legislating in areas that many Labour colleagues have campaigned for. There are some very good things in the bill around dangerous driving, around people who abuse their responsibilities as a coach, for example, or as a priest, and abuse young people. Why you need to start changing the rules around protest, why you need to start going after Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities, why you need to start introducing legislation that would compound and increase the problems of disproportionality for Black individuals in our criminal justice system can only be to pander to the extremism that we've talked about, and to bring that from the fringe into the mainstream, to create these wedge issues and these culture wars around issues that are just so important and so challenging. And so you're absolutely right. This is not just about the far right. It's about the way so-called mainstream politicians deliberately stoke this as part of their electoral base.
Thanks, David.
I'll just jump in. I'll jump in briefly on that. I can absolutely agree with what David's just said there. I think too often, we try to reflect that in this report this year. We've tried to provide a much more context, because too often the far right is viewed as this kind of cancerous tumour that hangs off the body politic. And if we can just cut it off, everything else will be fine. And of course, that's not how this works. This is more of a gangrenous limb that is infecting the body. And if we look at things like some of the rhetoric from Priti Patel around migrants in the summer and hotels and activist lawyers, extremely dangerous. And not just on that, but also if we look at some of the reaction around statues and the debates around statues and Black Lives Matter, again, really unacceptable. And I think what's important here is we've seen time and time again through history, whether or not it was 1979 when Margaret Thatcher talked about us being swamped with people of an alien culture to try and undermine the National Front. In the short term, it might take away the electoral success of the far right. But what it does is exactly as David says, is it normalizes the politics of the far right. And this is not just the Conservative Party. We've seen this with the Labour Party, with British jobs for British workers over the years. Any attempt by mainstream politics to outflank the far right on issues of race, immigration, identity, or integration, it will always be a failure. The only thing it will serve to do is they will never make those people happy. They will never outflank the far right on those issues, but they will make those things more normal. They will mainstream this sort of politics. And that's really, really dangerous. The whole point has to be to make sure the cordon sanitaire that isolates the far right and the politics of the far right remains in place. And if we let it open and we let that into the mainstream, we'll never get it out. So I think it's really, really important. I think the report does that this year. It does it. While of course, as an anti-fascist organisation, we focus on the far right and the threat posed by the far right, we do try to talk much more this year about how that interplays with mainstream politics and how we've seen the normalisation and mainstreaming of some of the rhetoric of the far right.
Can I just jump in? Sorry. I think it's really important to say is that because by saying all this, we will be accused of trying to avoid the debate, trying to kind of, ban any discussion around immigration or migration. That is definitely not the case at all. We have long argued that, we need to discuss all these issues. It's the manner in which the discussion happens. And I think what we have seen, and we've seen this over many, many years, all the talk about the hostile environment that was supposedly ending. I mean, even last November, Priti Patel kind of apologized again for the hostile environment, said lessons will be learned, but they aren't being learned. The rhetoric is deliberately being put out there to whip up a reaction. That's not about, these are important issues and there's only one way to talk about difficult or important issues. But, what is quite clear that's come out in the media so far, that there is a particular line that's being pushed out to present the government as being tough on immigration and migrants, but also to demonize anyone, particularly in the kind of legal profession, trying to stand up for basic human rights. And I think that that's a very toxic mix, which has real consequences in the real world. And I think that, it's not just a case of politicians need to act responsibly. Politicians need to be held to account. What they say, both on the record and as we see off the record, and pushing journalists on a particular line, have consequences in the real world, and they need to be held accountable for that.
Thank you. We have a question from Luke at Channel 4 News, and it says, we know that the far right hosts most of their communities away from the mainstream tech platforms. How do we combat these? Anyone want to jump in? Please feel free to do it.
Unless anyone else wants to, I'm happy to. Yeah, I mean, I think it's, again, we do talk about this in the report. Last year, we saw a real migration to alternative platforms. And at Hope Not Hate, we split platforms into mainstream platforms, which is Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, what we call co-opted platforms. And these are non-far right platforms, but are really heavily used by the far right, like Telegram, Discord, and then what we call bespoke platforms, which is increasingly the emergence of these platforms created by the far right for the far right. And I think what we've seen is actually most of the far right attempt to use all of these platforms simultaneously. I think there's a real misunderstanding that people start on Facebook, and once they're deplatformed, they work their way down until they're eventually on something else. There is some of that, but actually the far right use different platforms simultaneously for different purposes. If you take Patriotic Alternative, for example, they use YouTube for their more moderate live streams. Until they were banned on Facebook and Twitter, they used that for their most moderate content to recruit and to propagandize. They used open Telegram channels for things that were too extreme for Facebook, and they used closed Telegram channels for stuff that was about organizing and much more extreme. And then they used the video service BitChute for its most extreme content to be archived. They were using them all simultaneously. And so deplatforming, while it's really, really useful, only shuts down an element of the far right's ability to organize and do things. All these other places still exist. And I think this is why, as already been mentioned, the online harms bill is going to be really, really important. I'm slightly concerned that currently legislation, while it's of course time for legislation, the days of self-regulation in the tech space are over, and rightly so. If we overemphasize just the major platforms like Facebook, etc., these are platforms that, generally speaking, have been awful over the years, but do engage or will engage in some sort of good faith. They don't want neo-Nazis on their platform, broadly speaking. The legislation has to take into account these platforms that are consciously set up for neo-Nazis to propagate hate. And so I think it's going to be really important that when we talk about law enforcement, when we talk about legislation, when we talk about research as well, is to have to go beyond Facebook and Twitter, because the danger of the far right is not just its size. It's not just the fact that Patriotic Alternatives had 18,000 people on Facebook. We talk in the report about some of these smaller platforms like Telegram, where there might just be 50 people in the group, or even 10 people in the group in some cases. And the far right's danger is not just about its size, it's about its extremeness. And these smaller platforms, they're much more extreme. They're much more dangerous in terms of things like attacks and terrorism. So I think we need to make sure that the online harms bill and the legislation that comes forward goes well beyond mainstream platforms and really looks and digs into these smaller platforms to make sure that they are held accountable. And too often at the moment, the response to that is small platforms won't be able to deal with this kind of heavy regulation. But my feeling is very much, if you owned a creche for children and children kept dying in it and it kept being harmed in it, if they turned around and said, we can't afford to hire more staff, we wouldn't say that that's acceptable. And the same thing is happening here. If the platforms have to be built in a way that makes them safe and responsible. It's about design. It's about designing against hate, not just moderating against hate. And so we need to do that. And that's going to be involved in taking these smaller platforms and making sure we hold them accountable as well.
Thanks, Joe. And if anyone in the panel wants to feed into anything, please feel free to do that. And since we're talking about platforms, there's a question that came up. Nick and David and Roxana, if you want to feed back in. What about Instagram? So media coverage has focused on Instagram a lot today. Is Instagram worse than other platforms? And why is it that this platform is attracting young Nazis even more?
I mean, I'm happy to start off. I mean, I think that, as you say, I mean, our report looks at two groups in particular. One, the British Hand, which was set up, or we exposed last summer, which was a kind of terrorist group, a British teenage Nazi terrorist group. And after we exposed it, 3 alleged members are now awaiting trial on terrorist offences, and then also the the National Partisan Movement. That's a global movement that has people in 13 different countries, principally the US, Sweden, and then the UK. I think what it partly is that young people use Instagram, so that becomes an obvious place where they try to organise. And I think, as Joe kind of really eloquently explained, the kind of far right will use whatever platform they can. So as young people use Instagram, so that becomes a platform to operate in. I mean, I think also that Instagram has probably had less regulation, or at least enforcement of rules, compared to some of the other platforms, even compared to Facebook, which obviously Facebook owns Instagram. So I think there is some job to catch up there. But I think what's important is that we've got to look at where people are operating, how they're using these, and how these platforms are facilitating extremists to thrive, and be that kind of on the terrorist end, be that in the kind of more mainstream kind of far right end. I think that more needs to be done, both to monitor, but I think, as Joe said, we need to build into the design systems to kind of contain hate.
Thanks. And to add on to the questions about teenagers, what are preventative steps for teenage radicalization, and how can they be put in place? And another question that also came in about this was if it's true that boys are more susceptible to far right extremism as opposed to girls.
I mean, just to start that, yes. I mean, clearly, both in terms of the teenage terrorists that we've seen over the last few years in the UK, but also the extreme end of the far right in the UK, it is overwhelmingly men. It's not exclusively. There have been some examples of young women being involved as well. I mean, I think there is a number of things, as we highlight in the report. I do a piece looking back over 25 years of kind of Nazi terrorism in the UK. Nazi terrorism isn't new. Obviously, there's a lot of publicity around it now, but in fact, you can go back to David Copeland in 1999 and the London nail bombs. You had the kind of Ricin plot in 2010. I mean, there's been a whole spate over that period. But I think there is some worrying kind of trends that are going on. First of all, the age of the people getting involved is changing. It is getting younger. Over the last 12 months, 12 people have been convicted of far right of terrorist offences in the UK. 6 of those people have been teenagers. We have another 11 people awaiting trial now. So the numbers of people going through the courts is increasing. The numbers of teenagers is massively increasing. But also, I think the other really worrying element of it is the kind of increasing sadistic nature of the far right online. The open advocacy of kind of rape and sexual violence. This is something that we we didn't see 20 years ago. Yes, the far right had very negative and sexist attitudes towards women, but there wasn't what we're seeing now, where the kind of open call for kind of sexual abuse, for rape, the sharing of kind of child porn, the sharing of rape videos that we're seeing. This is very new, and is one of the reasons, and there's a common thread behind all this, and that's the Order of Nine Angles, which is this kind of Nazi Satanist group that we've been campaigning for the government for the past 12 months now for the government to ban, which they still have not done. But that is one of the currents through many of these trials. But I mean, certainly from our schools work, we as Hope Not Hate do a lot of work in schools, and certainly what we find there is that many young people kind of self-police themselves about language. They know they can't say certain things about race or racism. But when it comes to women, when it comes to misogyny, when it comes to feminism, they use very, very aggressive language. And in a way, the school system is not set up to deal with this. When teachers, particularly kind of female teachers, raise these issues, they're often targeted by their pupils online and in the classroom, and there isn't the support system in the educational system to both deal with this issue, but to deal with women teachers. So, I mean, I do find a correlation between what the far right are doing, the increasingly violent misogynistic language, and some of the trends we're seeing amongst young people. We, Hope Not Hate Charitable Trust, we did a survey last summer of young people between 16 and 25, and it was really worrying, the attitudes of many young men towards women, which goes, as I say, goes beyond some of the kind of traditional sexist attitude in the past, but quite aggressive, quite blaming, quite targeting, and I really do think that there is an overlap between his issues, and both as a society as a whole, but also in terms of the government, the policing, the educational departments, they have not got a handle on this, and I really think that we've got to do a lot more.
Thank you. So just to shift gears a little bit, there's also a question about how if there's a link between the far right and climate change denial, and what are those links? Joe, I can see that
yeah, sure. Sorry, I feel like I'd keep talking here, so please do someone else jump in if you want to. So on the issue of climate change now, yeah, it's something that we've really been looking at quite closely in the last 3 or 4 years, especially. And it's actually quite a complex picture, right? There was a time, I think, when most of the far right, except for very small sections, would have denied climate change. And I think especially in North America, this remains a real major plank of right-wing and Republican politics and beyond into the extremes of the far right. And there is some of that, of course. We still see kind of elements of the far right in Europe deny climate change. The AfD in Germany with its pro-diesel campaigns. But they do increasingly look anachronistic, actually. Much of the contemporary far right is attempting in some ways to co-opt the issue of climate change. And the way they're doing that is in a number of ways. Some of it is about kind of really extreme eco-fascism. We've seen in a number of the terrorist attacks in El Paso and a few others, if you look at the manifestos, they talk about the need to control populations and hence, by killing people. So this kind of strain of eco-fascism, blood and soil, which goes back all the way to the Nazis, we see that, and we're seeing kind of increasing levels of that on things like Telegram in the more extreme channels that we monitor. But there's also this broader thing, which is about the protection of what they would say is like ecology, right? The protection of the environment. And they broaden out the environment to go beyond merely the climate. And they talk about, culture and identity and kind of the green fields and the land. And again, it's kind of this blood and soil element slightly to it. And so increasingly, we're actually seeing elements of the far right not deny that climate change is a problem, but try and co-opt the issue and say the solution to it is an end to immigration, is to reduce populations, is to buy only to buy local. And so, we've seen this with the Front National in France, for example. And actually, there's an article by my colleague David Lawrence in This State of Hate, where he talks about how we're seeing increasing levels of talk about ecology and green issues and the attempt to co-opt the issue about climate change and the green agenda by the far right. And this is, of course, in many ways is opportunistic. The polling is very clear that most people agree that climate change is a problem. The days when denying climate change was useful for political capital are gone. And so it's no surprise that we're seeing the far right attempting to pivot and co-opt the issue. But it is one to watch. Because there are we talk about a group like an identitarian group, front group in the State of Hate this year, which attempts to talk about being like not far right at all. It looks like it's about buying local and shopping local and local ingredients, and it's about anti-climate change. But it's also it's a far right or front group. So this is something to watch out. Yes, we'll see denial, and anywhere in Europe where we see the far right in power in parliamentary chambers, they continue to prohibit and block effective change against climate change. That remains true. But the other thing to worry about is not just denial and stopping change, it's actually about co-option. And we need to be careful as a progressive movement to keep our eye out for that.
Thanks, Joe. I'm aware we have about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to try to shift gear a bit and try to end things on more positive note. So I wanted to ask David, you ended your speech with a very hopeful note. Are you optimistic about winning the battles that we face, and what actually gives you hope that we are doing better and we can do better for the future?
Well, notwithstanding the issues that we've discussed, I am broadly hopeful about millennials and Generation Y and Z. I think younger generations on the whole, are progressive in relation to issues of race and racial justice, climate justice. Yes, they're losing out hugely in relation to the economics of our times, and we're in a deep recession that will go on for some time. But that's prompting them to move in a particular direction. And I think it is similar to the 1960s, which was the era of the baby boomers. In so many ways, those young people's parents. What we're seeing at the moment, I think, is, Generation Z, Y, millennials haven't got their hands on the levers of power. The levers of power are still very much in the hands of baby boomers and my generation, Generation X. And this is a transition period, and I'm afraid it's going to be a very tough period. But broadly, I'm hopeful that we will get there, that we will come out of this, and things will be much, much more positive. But it's a very rocky period still, and I think that's going to go on for a few years. And very, very sadly, the recession that we're in, I think, will be very significant and will, comes off the back of a period of austerity. So the challenges are going to be very, very hard. But in the medium to long term, I remain hopeful. I really do.
Thanks, David. Roxy, do you want to share a word or two about what gives you hope?
Yeah, I mean, I'd just like to echo what David said in terms of my hope for Gen Z. I mean, I'm a millennial myself, but kind of watching that come up through the ranks, kind of at protests and in activism gives me hope, and they're so switched on. So that gives me hope. Also, I think while lockdowns was really hard for communities, it also showed the strength of community action, and so many different communities came together to kind of support one another during lockdown. And I think we should channel that energy going forward and out of lockdown as well, and really appreciate that we need our communities, and that's how we can kind of build better societies together. So yeah, I'm hopeful for sure.
Thanks, Roxy. Joe?
Probably not the best person to ask this question. I spend too much time looking at the horribleness to be particularly hopeful, but I do very much agree with what's been said, actually. It's really easy to kind of, when you spend all day looking at this content, to get really down about it, but it is always worth remembering that it is a minority, right? And even in, when we talk about like the rise of the radical right across Europe, there's very few places, if anywhere, most of the time, they get a majority. They're still in a real minority. And I really agree about what was said about the pandemic. For all of the kind of nastiness and the far right's reaction to it and their attempt to exploit it with conspiracy theories, the much broader takeaway was people coming together, people looking after their neighbours, building bonds of solidarity in their local communities. And actually, I think in some ways that's going to make it harder for the far right. The far right prosper in communities when people don't know their neighbours. We've seen that for the last few decades at Hope Not Hate. When people know their neighbours, it's harder to believe lies about them. And I think the pandemic has really fused that together. People shopping for their elderly neighbours, people talking across fences, etc. I think in some ways that will make life harder for the far right. And so, I think we remain in the majority. And we've won before and we're going to win again. And so I generally am hopeful. I just, always urge a bit of vigilance.
And Nick as well. Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with everything that's been said, and I also think it's important to remember that. Clearly, much of our work and much of this report is focusing on, in a way, the hate side of society. It does involve a minority of people, and as our polling has shown, that the vast majority of Britons want to live together in peace. They want communities to be together. Some polling that we did just before Christmas in 8 countries across Europe found, notwithstanding the problems in the UK, but the British people are more tolerant and are more accepting of one another and different communities than every other country that we polled in Europe. As I say, notwithstanding the quite big problems that we have. I think what's important, and in a way this comes to the crux of what Hope Not Hate is, we are there to shine a light on, extremism, on hatred, try to help people find ways to push it back, to expose it, to beat it. But at the same time, the other element of our work, we're about holding the line. We're about creating the space so communities can self-organize, that people can get together, and in a way, hope can beat hate. So, notwithstanding the challenges, and I think we've got a few years of really difficult times ahead, I intrinsically have faith in the British people. I intrinsically have faith that good can beat evil. And I would really end up to say, if you agree with that, please support Hope Not Hate, support what we do, become a member of Hope Not Hate, join one of our local groups, get involved in your local community, seek the inspiration of Bradford and learn from that and try to do that in your own communities and hold politicians to account. And I think, these things combined can make us a much better society.
Thanks, Nick. I think I also want to say something about what gives me hope. And it's putting together everything everyone said. I feel like people are becoming more aware about the links between racism and structural racism, and links between fascism and racism, and how we can tackle that. I'm also very hopeful that people are seeing the ways communities are working, and that is actually effectively working against the narratives of hate. So I'm hopeful that us millennials, as David was saying, will bring the battle to boomers, to all the generations above, and that we're being more understood. So I'm very thankful that there is more data being gathered, and with that, we will do more work, but slowly but surely. So that's, I guess, is the end of our webinar and our launch. Before I go, I just want to say thank you to the panel. Thank you, David, especially for coming in and joining us this morning. We're very thankful to have you here and hearing your inspiring words. Also, thank you, Nick, Roxy, and Joe for fitting in with so important information from our State of Hate report. If you want to get hold of the report, please visit our website or email us. And also, if you want to support our work, please go into www.hopenahate.org.uk. There's a big red button that says become a member, and you can contribute and help or support our work monthly if you want to. We also publish magazines now and then. You can become a member of the magazine if you want to learn more about our work and read more about our research. And lastly, I also want to thank our members, our supporters, our local group, our activists, our volunteers that helps us do the work we're doing. Without you, we wouldn't be able to put this together. We wouldn't be able to work during the lockdown. I think we've been working even more during lockdown. And yeah, I just wanted to say thank you. This event has been recorded, so it will be live on YouTube, but we will also post this on our social media. So please feel free to send in some more questions on info@hopenahate.org.uk. And yeah, I think I'm ending 1 minute early. Look at that. We never do that. But yeah, thank you so much, everyone, and have a good rest of the week. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.